This is fascinating new research that's just come out in July. And I'm going to summarize it. I title this COVID Targets the Old and Unhealthy. Young and healthy need not fear. And there's a reason why I have the word fear in there that we can learn from this research. So, what will you learn in this video? You'll learn about this recent research on COVID-19, the relationship between age and COVID risk, the relationship between underlying conditions and COVID risk, and the underlying diseases that most raise COVID risk, and finally, the combined impact of underlying conditions and age. So there's a few sections I'm going to go through. First, I'm going to describe the study that was done and introduce you to it, and then we're going to look at the impact of underlying conditions, the impact of age, the combined impact of underlying conditions and age, and then the risk relative to someone with no underlying conditions, and then the risk for the top 4 underlying conditions. So let's go into the study description. This is new, original, peer-reviewed research. It was done by 20 doctors, and the authors have no funding to disclose, so no conflicts of interest, and it was published on the CDC website. So here is the research. The title is Underlying Medical Conditions and Severe Illness among 540,667 adults hospitalized with COVID-19 March 2020 to March 2021. What I like about it is that this is a research paper that was just published in July 2021. The second thing I like about this is that it's just analyzing the data that we have. It's not making any projections. It's just saying, what can we learn from the data that we have? And the last thing I like about it is that there's 20 doctors that have worked on this, and it's been published through this journal, Preventing Chronic Disease, and it has a relationship with the CDC. Now, these opinions and all that are not from the CDC. So let's talk about the universe of patients studied. There was 4,899,447 hospitalized adults in this period of time from March 2020 to March 2021. That was across 800 U.S. hospitals from this period. Now, the research was of 540,667 adult hospitalized patients with COVID. So about 5 million hospitalized adults, about 500,000 were COVID patients. Makes you think, oh, I forgot, there was 4.5 million people that were hospitalized in this period of time. And also an interesting point is that 94.9% had at least one underlying medical condition. Now, the most frequent underlying condition in the universe of patients studied was hypertension, which was 50%, the disorder of lipid metabolism, which was also about 50%. And remember that that's about the fatty substances in the blood and tissues. We're talking about cholesterol and those types of diseases. And then there was obesity. 33% of the people who showed up were obese. Now, research considered 3 outcomes and 2 factors. The 3 outcomes were intensive care unit admission, invasive mechanical ventilation, or IMV, meaning putting a tube down their throat to help them breathe, or down their throat and in their lungs to help them breathe, and then there was death. So they also looked at the estimated adjusted risk associated with 2 factors. First, the underlying disease, and second, age. Within the underlying disease, they looked at both the most frequent underlying chronic conditions and the total number of conditions. It's important to note also that they tried to focus on chronic conditions, conditions that happened before COVID hit. Now, the main risk factors, the study found these strong risk factors for severe COVID illness. So here's the punchline: obesity, fear and anxiety disorder, diabetes with complication, and the total number of conditions. These 4 factors were the things that they looked at and they found were the most dangerous. Now, I want to stop here just for a moment and say, fear and anxiety disorders? What the heck's that? Well, in fact, a large number of people who passed away from COVID in this study had this fear and anxiety disorder. And I would say that was probably accelerated by the mania that was going on in the US at the time. Now let's talk about the impact of underlying conditions. There's 5 ranges of underlying conditions. There's people who have greater than 10 underlying conditions. I know you're saying to yourself, how can somebody have greater than 10? There are people. There were some people that had 6 to 10 underlying conditions, some that had 2 to 5, and then there was 1, and then there was 0. So the 0 is kind of the base case that they use in this research. So let's let's look at these numbers right here. I'm going to put them on on the x-axis, and I made these charts and graphs to try to illustrate what's in this research. But these are ICU admissions, and they want to look at the ICU admissions relative to the number of underlying diseases. So what did they find? Well, you can see, first of all the way to the left, greater than 10 underlying diseases basically was 20% of the people who got admitted into ICU. And that went up, actually, which is a little bit weird, it went up to 34 for 6 to 10, and then it went up a little bit more for 2 to 5. But what we can see is that 91 had 2 or more underlying diseases. So if you had 2 or more underlying diseases, it's most likely that you got admitted into ICU. Now next is the invasive mechanical ventilation, IMV. And here we can see something quite similar. In fact, we'll see that 95% had 2 or more underlying diseases. And next we'll look at deaths. And here we can see that we can find that 96% had 2 or more underlying diseases. In fact, what you can see is about 4%, or 2,827 people across all of America, across all these hospitals, of the 80,000 that died, had none or one underlying disease. So let's now look at the impact of age. That tells us about underlying disease, and I think you can make the conclusion from this research that the people that died in the past were pretty unhealthy. They had a lot of underlying diseases. Now let's look at the ranges of age. They looked at 6 ranges, greater than 85 years old. And you're going to see some interesting statistics here with that one. 75 to 84, 65 to 74, 50 to 64, 40 to 49, and then 18 to 39. A pretty big jump there for the 18 to 39. That's a very wide range. But they didn't look at any people under the age of 18. So now let's look at the ICU admissions. And now at the bottom, you're going to see those ranges from the oldest to the youngest. So let's see what we can find out. And here we can see a pretty steady case of 83% were 50 years or older. Now this is less than what we saw with the underlying conditions, meaning age wasn't the ultimate killer, underlying conditions were, or at least when it comes to admissions into the hospital. We'll look at deaths in just a moment. But also you can see that I've always wondered, what about this group of people that are 80, 85 or older? But you could also argue that those people have pretty strong immune systems. So that's why I think the bar is kind of low there. Now, let's look at the invasive mechanical ventilation. Now, what we can see here is 87% were 50 years or older. So it's starting to rise. And we can see they did it less in people that are over 85 or 85. Now, of course, there's less people that are of that age group. So that's part of the reason why the bar is low at 6.1. And it's low in each one of these graphs. And there's less people in 75 to 84. So really, we're looking at these 65 to 74 and the 50 to 74. But here's where it gets interesting. Basically, if we look at deaths, we can see 95% of deaths were 50 years or older. And in fact, you could say 65 years really is the starting point where it starts to really accelerate up to 26.7. But let's just say 50 years or older. I'm 55, so I'm right on the borderline, but I have no underlying conditions, so I feel like I'm in pretty good shape. About 5% or 4,000 people of the 80,000 who died had none or one underlying disease. A low, low number. And the average age of those who died was 74 years old. So we can see that old age and also underlying conditions are the major factors. Now, what I want to do now, this research did not look at that combined impact, because what if somebody's 65 and they have underlying conditions? What's the probability that they're going to die of COVID? You could imagine it's pretty high. But they didn't publish that in this research. Maybe they've got that coming out later. So I wanted to try to put that together. So let's look at the combined. Though the authors did not determine the combination of age with many comorbidities, we can make an approximation of what that would have looked like. This is the research. I've just been going over it and over it and over it. Very excellent research. So I'm going to create a matrix here, And that's of the two separate scores related to the 80,000 people that died. So we're not going to look at ICUs. We're not going to look at the IMVs for invasive mechanical ventilation. So what we're going to look at is just deaths. And here you can see, I'm looking on this side, is the underlying conditions. In fact, what you can see is at the top of this, I'll just highlight that, at the top of this is greater than 10 conditions, and we know that that was about 25% of the people who died. We can also see that 2.6 down to 0.9, these are people that had one or none conditions, and that was a very, very small group. All right, let's continue on. Now, let's look at the bottom of this table that I'm going to present to you. And all this now is we can see that this is the age. So here we can see people that were greater than or equal to 85, and we can see this number up there, that's 20.7. Let's bring it all together, and here's where I try to create some kind of red zone. And then I show in the upper right-hand corner, let's just look at right in the upper right-hand corner. So right here, you can see that what I'm doing is I'm taking the 25 from over here, and I'm taking the 21 from over here. And the result of that is that I'm trying to show kind of what's the risk in that area. And you can see that 2 to 5 underlying conditions is going to give you 32%. That's a pretty high number. And 20, if you're over 65, that's 27. That's a pretty high number. It's very close to the 29 in the next grouping. So I put those together. That would give you the red zone. But also what's interesting for young people is that in this green zone, it is very safe. Obviously, if you're young, let's say you're 18 to 39, and you have no pre-existing conditions, you're safe, very safe from COVID. Now, if you're young, according to this data, not according to my opinion, I'm just reviewing what I found in this data. But what I would also say is that if you were young and you had many underlying conditions, then you are at risk for sure. Now, let's look at the risk relative to someone with no underlying conditions that also came in and into the hospital, was a hospitalization. We'll talk about the adjusted risk ratio. Next in the study, they compared various levels of underlying conditions. The base was measured as 1, and that was those who had no underlying diseases. So let's look at the adjusted risk ratio for ICU admissions. Here's the table that they presented. And what we can see here is that patients with greater than 10 conditions, that's this group right here, and that would be this group right there, we can see that it was a 96%, right? It's 1.96. That's the adjusted risk ratio, but that means that they're 1.96 times the 1, or 96% higher chance of being admitted in the ICU compared to those with no conditions. Those with one condition had a 32% higher chance for admission, not for death, of course. Now we're going to look at the invasive mechanical ventilation, IMV, and we can see here that patients with greater than 10 conditions, again, now we're up here at the top section, had 347%, that's 4.4 multiple, but this is in percent, higher chance of being on there. Now, also, those with one condition had a 57% higher chance also. So one condition was risky as far as IMV. Now finally, let's look at death here, and what we can see in this table is we can say patients with greater than 10 conditions, again, that's right here, and they had a 282%, right? 3.82 is the adjusted risk ratio. So we can see like a clustering right here, which basically says that if you're in these conditions, you have underlying conditions, a lot of them, chances are you're going to get IMV. But the chances of you dying are a little bit less, but we can definitely say that this group right here is much more likely to get to die, basically, from COVID. So those with one condition had a 53% chance. What I'm talking about is this amount right here, compared to someone with no conditions. That means someone that's perfectly healthy. Now let's look at the risk for the top 4 underlying conditions. We're talking about 10 conditions. Well, they actually had a long list of many conditions, but I'm just going to look at the 4 main ones, right? They looked at the adjusted risk ratio for the various underlying diseases. Remember, the adjusted risk ratio is the risk compared to someone with no underlying condition. I'm just going to review the 4 highest. Number 1, in rank order. the most dangerous one was obesity. The second one was anxiety and fear-related disorder. Have you felt fear during the COVID pandemic? Everybody's felt fear. And we can see that, of course, there were some organizations that fed fear, but here we can see that fear and anxiety were a major contributor to death. Very fascinating out of this research. Diabetes with complication was number 3, and then chronic kidney disease was number 4. So let's look at these 4 items and what we can conclude from looking at the adjusted risk ratios here. We can see that there was a 30%, right, 30% higher chance of death for those with obesity, 28% for those with anxiety and fear-related disorders, 26% for those with diabetes with complications, and 21% for chronic kidney disease. Again, this was an excellent paper. There's no judgment or forecast out of this paper. It is basically looking at the data that we have since March 20 to March 21 and analyzing. So what have you learned in this? Well, first of all, you've learned that 95% of COVID deaths arose in those older than 49. But we kind of knew that, right? I mean, that was Italy. We saw older people dying in Italy much more disproportionately than younger people. Separately, if we look at that, put aside the age, and now we're just going to look at the underlying conditions, we can see that 96% of that group of COVID deaths arose from those with 2 or more underlying conditions. And those with more than 10 underlying conditions had a 347% higher chance of dying than those with none. Finally, we saw the most dangerous underlying diseases are obesity, fear and anxiety disorders, diabetes, and chronic kidney disease. And I'll wrap up by saying a combination of underlying diseases and age cause ICU admissions, IMV, and the death rate to rise. There's so much to learn from this research. I appreciate that they did it. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, any comments, please leave them in the comment section.